Hello, Malcolm here, and welcome to Tuesday Teaching Tips, episode 321. Today is the seventh in our current series, which is the 10 Commandments of Effective Teaching and Preaching, which I borrowed from my friend Rob Payne. And today is the sixth commandment, which is every learner is different, so differentiate. Every learner is different, so differentiate in the way that you teach and preach. What's our goal here? Our goal is to be a bit more like Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 14, where it says that they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. You and I can teach, we can preach, but are we being effective? And I hope that these commandments will help us to be more effective, and let me know what you think as to how helpful it is. Now, a note from a previous episode. Last time we talked about how we help people not just to hear what we're teaching, but actually to learn from it. This last Sunday, we were very blessed to have Mike Desouza speak for us in the Watford Church of Christ. He was our visiting speaker, and he finished with a bit of time to spare. Thank you, Mike, for that. And afterwards, I stood up and I said, why don't we have a bit of sharing? What touched people today? What did you learn? What did you hear that spoke to you? What did God say to you through the lesson? And we had 5, maybe 10 minutes where people just said, I heard this from God, or this affected me in some way. Thank you for this. It helped me because really helpful. And it did a number of things. Firstly, it drew us together, bonded us as a fellowship. Secondly, it meant that we knew what to pray for each other. Thirdly, I think it was affirming for Mike, and not that's the reason I did it, but of course it's nice for him to hear that people actually did find some benefit, not in a generic sense, but in a specific way. And fourthly, it helped me as someone shepherding the congregation in some sense to have confidence that people here are actually learning. Why don't you have a go at that? Leave some space at the end of your next lesson deliberately so that you can help people to solidify what they've been learning. Anyway, that's from last time. Let's talk about this differentiation because people are different. Now, a point of clarification before we go on to the tips. Firstly, unless you're speaking to a really small group of people, you can never really know all the differences in your audience that are in front of you. And the differences could be cultural, it could be educational, social background, personality, familiarity with scripture is going to vary from person to person. The length of time someone is a Christian is going to make their experience of what you speak about very different. The current circumstances of their work life, their family life, you may not know about. The current state of their walk with Jesus, how things are going at home with their children or their spouse. These are things you may not know about. And there's more than that, of course. However, if you speak regularly to the same group, you will become aware of many of the differences that exist, and you can make adjustments to your speaking accordingly. So what we're talking about here today has its limits. You can never know everything, but that doesn't mean you can't make some adjustments on the basis of what you do know, or even what you observe on the day that you're speaking. We do well to adjust our lessons according to the circumstances. Take Paul's sermon in Athens in Acts chapter 17, not long after Paul and Barnabas are in Iconium. In chapter 17, he's very aware, Paul, of the intellectuals, the philosophers in Athens. He acknowledges their religious inclinations, so many religions, so many gods, and quotes from their own poets to connect with them. He's making an adjustment. He talks about the unknown God that they worshipped and uses that as a way in to talk to them about Jesus. And even Jesus, of course, we can see him communicating very differently to, say, Nicodemus and then the woman at the well, John chapter 3, John chapter 4. Very different conversations approached in a different way because they were different people. You could say it's the same message, but Jesus is differentiating according to who he's speaking to. And that's what we're talking about here today. So with those thoughts in mind, here are a few tips to give you your best opportunity, I hope, to connect with as wide a variety of people in your audience as possible. Firstly, number one, most importantly, pray. Pray about connecting with your audience, the people there. If you know who will be there, pray for them personally, specifically. I do that often for our Watford church. I pray through the membership. It helps me to connect. I remember they are different people. They're not sort of one blob in front of me. They're not. They're all different. If you know who'll be there, pray for them. God surely will grant you insight, whether consciously or subconsciously, that will help you to connect in that way. So number one, pray. Number two, offer some personal sharing, something from you, your life. Opening up about your own life helps to connect with all kinds of people. The cultural differences tend to be less significant, or the educational differences tend to be less significant when we're talking about our own hearts. Now, of course, there are some things that may not communicate across cultures, but nonetheless, When you're talking personally, you're talking as a person, as a human being, and we're all human beings. So personal sharing can help that. And of course, vulnerability creates connection, no matter what the background of the people you're speaking to. And that connection will survive cultural barriers. Thirdly, do your best to avoid jargon. Avoid jargon. Bear in mind, you might have people there who have no faith. They've got no Christian faith, or at least not much. And so if you start using not just religious jargon, but church jargon, it will alienate them, and then that will help make it harder for them to connect. So avoid the jargon. Fourthly, ask questions in your presentation, in your talk, and mean them as real questions. Sometimes you hear a preacher or teacher ask a question and they're not really asking. They say, what did Jesus mean by that? Well, what he meant by that was, and then they go on and tell you, rather than, what do you think Jesus meant by that? And whether they want someone to speak an answer or just reflect on the answer, there's got to be a pause. There's got to be a bit of a gap, some space for people to think. So ask questions and expect answers. Questions draw people in, no matter what background they're from, and help them to think about what you're saying, and that will help them to connect. Fifthly, vary your style of the way that you communicate what you are teaching about. In other words, use, if possible, a mix of speaking, of video clips, of visuals, pictures and that kind of thing, handouts, discussion, format. The more you vary it, the more likely you are to be able to draw in and connect with a wider variety of people. You'll reach a larger proportion of those listening to you. Number 6, offer practical suggestions in your talks. Offer potential ways your listeners can implement what you're talking about from the scriptures. For some people, joining the dots between principle and application is more important than others. Some people will make that jump naturally. That's the way they're wired. Other people will need you to say, I've been talking about this principle. Here are some ways you could apply them. Not to say this is what you have to do, it's the only way, but more, here's an example. Avoid telling people precisely what to do, but at least give them an idea. Number 7, pause. Well, we already talked about this a little bit, but we're a little bit more on this now. Pause every now and again in your talk. Some people process things really quickly. You say it and they've got it like that. Others, less so. So one technique you should employ is to take time during your presentation to pause from time to time to say, let me just let you think about that for a minute. What do you think about this point? Why don't you meditate on this? Why don't you pray even as you're sitting there and ask God to give you some insight? What's your take on why Jesus did this? And you may say, I don't want an answer right now. I want you to just stop and think about it. Let them think. And that will help the people who process things a little slower or more differently, give them some space and time to engage with what you're talking about. Or else what will happen is you'll ask a question, you'll make a point, you're on to your next point. They're still with you in your last point. They're not following you on to your next point, and you've lost them along the way. And after a certain length of time, they'll just give up because they're still on point 3 when you're on point 7. And what's the point in them carrying on listening to your points? So stop for a moment or a minute or 2 or 3 now and again and allow people time to reflect on what you have been saying. You don't have to use all these tips every time you speak, but at least make them part of your arsenal of tools with which you can then help people to connect. So let me know what you think about this. I'd be interested to know what happens if you use any of these, which ones interest you the most. Variety is the spice of life, they say, and God has given you and I a variety of people to speak to. Therefore, we should vary our presentation style and our content. And above all, this is my final point, which is so important. Above all things, keep the focus of your talk on God, on the Father, on Jesus as the Son, on the Holy Spirit. If all else fails in your presentation, and if all else fails in your ability to connect with people, even if you are culturally insensitive, educationally patronizing, or overly intellectual, if you talk about God with spiritual discernment and with passion, you can be sure that those listening to you will find some benefit from your lesson. Let me know what you think about this. Next week, it's the 7th commandment. They won't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That's for next Tuesday. And in the meantime, I would thoroughly encourage you to engage with the AIM UK and Ireland program. You can find us AIM UK and Ireland, all one word. And next module is homiletics, which is about speaking. speaking about God through and about his word to other people. I'm sure you'd enjoy it. It's in September, but you can sign up now. Send me an email if you're not sure how to do that. Please leave a comment. Let's learn together, because we learn better when we're learning in community. If you've got any questions, drop me a line. If you'd like a free copy of my book on spiritual disciplines, then sign up for my newsletter at my website, malcolmcox.org. Pass this link on, subscribe, leave a review, and until the next time, I hope that you are able to find ways to connect with people better than you ever thought was possible. Take care, and God bless.